The wind slammed against my cabin like it wanted to break the door down, and under that wind I heard scratching. Not the scratching of a branch, not the scratching of an animal looking for shelter. This was slow, deliberate, like something was asking to be let in. I grabbed the old lantern from the shelf and opened the door with my heart pounding harder than it had in years. What stood there on my porch, soaked and shaking in the freezing rain, was not a wolf, not a bear, not anything native to this frontier world. It was small, no bigger than a large dog, with wet black scales that shimmered faintly blue under the lantern light, folded wings pressed tight against its body, and eyes that glowed like embers even through the storm. A dragon hatchling, a real one. From the Veil Tharu bloodlines that most humans in this galaxy had only heard about in fearful whispers. I had seen dragonkin exactly once before in my life, years ago, during the evacuation of Halden's Ridge, back when I still wore a uniform, and still believed the galaxy made sense. I never expected to see one again, and certainly never expected one to show up bleeding at my door in the middle of nowhere. It looked up at me, and something in its eyes made my breath catch. Recognition. Not fear, not curiosity. Recognition. Like it already knew exactly who I was. I stepped back and let it in before I could stop myself. The moment it crossed the threshold, it collapsed onto my floor, chest rising and falling too fast, one wing bent at a wrong angle. My training kicked in before my confusion could. I knelt beside it, ran my hands along its side, feeling for broken bone, feeling for the kind of injury that kills quietly if you wait too long to notice it. There were claw marks across its flank, not animal claws, something bigger, something that had been hunting it. My mind went back, unwillingly, to Halden's Ridge. The colony had been collapsing under enemy fire, buildings folding in on themselves, and I had gone back into a crumbling structure that everyone told me to leave alone, because I heard something crying inside it. What I found was a dying Veil Tharu matriarch, her body pinned beneath rubble, and beside her, a clutch of eggs glowing faintly gold. She was already beyond saving. I could see that in her eyes, but the eggs were still warm. I remember pulling them out one by one, wrapping them in my jacket, running through smoke, and falling debris, while half my unit screamed at me over the comm to abandon the objective and get out. I got 2 eggs to the evacuation shuttle before the building came down completely. I never found out what happened to them after that. The Veil Tharu representatives took the eggs without a word of thanks, without so much as a glance in my direction, like I had simply done what any tool was built to do. I spent months afterward wondering if it had even mattered. Now, years later, one of those eggs was lying on my cabin floor, grown into a hatchling, bleeding in front of me, and looking at me like I was the only safe place left in the universe. I worked through the night. I did not have proper medical supplies for a creature like this, so I improvised, cleaning the wounds with what I had, splinting the wing as best I could with strips of cloth and a length of wood shaved smooth. The hatchling never once tried to bite me, never thrashed, never fought my hands even when I knew I was causing it pain. It simply watched me the entire time, its glowing eyes following my every movement like it was memorizing my face. By the time the storm broke and gray morning light crept through my windows, the hatchling was asleep, curled up near the fireplace, its breathing finally even. I sat back against the wall, exhausted, and allowed myself to really look at it. The markings along its neck were unmistakable now that I saw them clearly. The same golden pattern I remembered from that dying matriarch years ago. This was one of her children. This was one of the eggs I had carried out of a burning building with my own hands. I did not know dragonkin could imprint before hatching. I did not know a species famous across the galaxy for barely acknowledging the existence of humans could form any kind of bond with one. But sitting there, watching this small creature breathe steadily for the first time since it arrived, I understood, somewhere deep and wordless, that it had chosen me a long time ago, long before it ever had eyes to see me with. The peace did not last. 3 days later, I heard engines. Not the low rumble of a supply hauler passing overhead, but the sharp, precise whine of a Veil Tharu skiff, descending fast and controlled. I stepped outside just as it landed in the clearing beyond my cabin, kicking up dust and dried leaves. 2 figures emerged, tall and armored, their scaled faces unreadable, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. The hatchling, healing well but still limping slightly, pressed itself against my leg, a low sound rumbling in its throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a whimper. The taller of the two Veiltharu spoke first, its voice clipped and translated through a device on its collar. It said the creature belonged to their bloodline registry, that it had been reported missing from a secured hatchery 3 weeks ago, and that I was to hand it over immediately for its own safety and mine. I asked why a hatchling would run from a secured hatchery in the first place. Neither of them answered that question. That silence told me more than anything they could have said. I told them the creature was injured, that it had come to me on its own, bleeding and hunted, and that whatever had chased it here was not something I was willing to hand it back into blindly. The shorter one took a step forward, clearly unused to a human refusing a direct instruction. I did not move. I am not a large man, and I am certainly not as strong as I was during my service years, but I have stood my ground against worse things than 2 irritated aliens on my own porch, and something in me simply would not let this go. The hatchling stepped out from behind my leg then, placing itself between me and them, small and limping, and utterly unafraid. A thin ribbon of pale blue light traced along its scales, faint but unmistakable, the kind of glow I had only ever heard described in old stories about dragonkin defending their bonded partner. Both Veiltharu went very still. The taller one spoke again, but the tone had changed completely, no longer clipped and procedural, but low and careful, almost reverent. It asked me, directly this time, how long I had known this creature. I told them the truth. I told them about Halden's Ridge, about the matriarch, about the eggs I carried out with my own hands, while the building fell apart around me. I told them I had not seen this hatchling since that day, and had no idea it even remembered me, let alone that it would somehow find its way across space to my cabin door. The shorter one turned to the taller one and said something quickly in their own language, too fast for the translator to catch cleanly, but I heard the word bonded repeated twice, each time with more disbelief than the last. Before either of them could decide what to do next, the sky above the clearing darkened with the shadow of a much larger ship descending, one bearing markings I did not recognize but instantly understood, carried far more authority than the skiff already on my land. My stomach tightened. Whatever was happening here had just gotten much bigger than 2 enforcers and a wounded hatchling. The new ship landed with barely a sound, its hull settling into the grass with practiced precision. A ramp lowered, and a single figure descended, older than the other 2 by the silver threading through the scales along its face, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had never once needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. The 2 enforcers straightened immediately, stepping back to make room. The elder Veiltharu approached slowly, its glowing eyes moving from me to the hatchling pressed protectively against my leg, and back to me again. It studied us both for a long moment without speaking, and I found myself standing very still, unsure whether I was about to be thanked or condemned. Finally, it spoke, and its voice through the translator was quieter than the others, almost gentle. It said that in the recorded history of their people, stretching back further than most species had even existed, a dragonkin hatchling had never once imprinted on a being outside their own bloodline. It said the bond forming before hatching was considered sacred, unbreakable, something no outside force, however powerful, was permitted to interfere with once it had taken hold. It asked me again, more carefully this time, to explain exactly what had happened at Halden's Ridge. So I told the story again, this time from the beginning, sparing no detail. I told them about the alarms, about the order to evacuate immediately, about the sound of crying that made me turn back when every instinct told me to keep running. I told them about the matriarch, barely breathing, pinned beneath collapsed stone, and how she had looked at me not with fear, but with something that felt, even then, like trust. I told them I did not save her. I could not. But I saved what she asked me to save, without a single word passing between us, because somehow, in that moment, I understood exactly what she needed from me. The elder listened without interrupting, its expression unreadable throughout, until I finished. Then it turned toward the hatchling and spoke a few soft words in their own language, low and musical, nothing like the clipped commands the enforcers had used earlier. The hatchling limped forward, still favoring its healing wing, and pressed its head against the elder's outstretched hand, but its body never left my side for more than a moment before it turned and pressed back against my leg again, as if reminding everyone present exactly where it belonged. The elder straightened and looked at me with something that might have been respect, though I could not read Vale Tharu expressions well enough to be certain. It explained, slowly, that the hatchling had escaped its hatchery 3 weeks earlier, not by accident, but by design, slipping past its handlers the moment it was strong enough to fly even short distances, driven by an instinct none of them had understood until this very moment. It had crossed dangerous, unmapped territory, avoided predators far larger than itself, and survived injuries that would have ended a lesser creature, all to reach a single point in space it had never physically seen before, but somehow always knew. Me. The elder said this kind of bond, once formed, could not be undone by law, by tradition, or by force, and that any attempt to separate us now would likely harm the hatchling in ways that could never be repaired. It said, plainly, that I was now recognized under Vale Tharu law as a bonded partner, a title it admitted had never once in their long history been given to a human, or to any species outside their own. I did not know what to say to that. I still do not fully know what to say to that, even now, replaying it in my mind. I had spent years after Halden's Ridge believing that single act of pulling eggs from a burning building had meant nothing to anyone but me, a private decision made in a moment of chaos that changed nothing in the wider galaxy. And now I was being told it had quietly reshaped the future of an entire species' oldest tradition, all because a dying mother had trusted a stranger with what mattered most to her, and her child had never forgotten that trust, not even before it had a mind of its own to remember with. The enforcers who had come to reclaim the hatchling did not argue with the elder's decision. They simply bowed, low and formal, first to the elder, then, to my genuine surprise, to me, before returning to their skiff and departing without another word. The elder remained a while longer, explaining what this bond would mean going forward, the responsibilities it carried, the protections it offered, the strange new position I now held in the eyes of a species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence before this day. It spoke of ceremonies that would need to happen eventually, of records that would need to be updated across systems I had never even heard of a future far larger and stranger than the quiet, isolated life I had built for myself, out here at the edge of everything. I listened to all of it, nodding when it seemed appropriate, while the hatchling settled slowly onto the ground beside me, worn out from the tension of the encounter, its glowing eyes drifting half shut in the fading afternoon light. Before the elder finally returned to its ship, it paused at the base of the ramp and looked back at me one last time. It said something I have not stopped thinking about since. It said that humans were often spoken of, among its people, as a species too young to understand loyalty the way older civilizations did, too quick to abandon what did not immediately benefit them. It said that this hatchling, and the mother who chose to trust me with her final act, had proven every one of those assumptions wrong. Then the ship rose into the sky and disappeared, leaving me standing alone on my porch once more, except this time, not entirely alone. The hatchling stirred beside me, nudging its head gently against my hand, and I found myself smiling despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite the sheer strangeness of everything that had just happened in the space of a single afternoon. I do not know what the coming months will bring. I do not know what it means, practically, to be bonded to a creature that will one day grow larger than my entire cabin, stronger than anything else on this world, and carry with it a weight of history I am still only beginning to understand. But I know this much, sitting here now with the fire crackling low and a small healing dragon curled quietly against my side. Years ago, in the middle of chaos and fire, I made a choice that felt small at the time, barely worth mentioning, a single decision, made in a handful of desperate seconds. I never expected it to follow me across the galaxy. I never expected it to knock on my door years later, wounded and searching, having crossed unimaginable distance for no reason except that, somewhere deep inside, it had never stopped believing I would open that door when it finally arrived. I did open it, and I would open it again, without a single moment of hesitation, every single time.